I feel like I have one shot, one opportunity to get a 5 on this AP Gov test. I'm gonna capture it, just let it slip, man. I can't tell you all my wins, it'd take an hour to list them, but one thing I know was about federalism. A style of government where states and federal reign supreme. It sounds complicated, but wait, I tell you what I mean. Man, I don't know how to cook, but I do know how to bake, especially getting Gucci in that marble cake. Lego. Just kidding. Welcome to Kolb's Connections, your one-stop shop for AP Gov. Today we're on video 2 of 11 looking at federalism. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Please turn me up in my headphones. Our country was one of the first to employ a federal system of government. While this system makes a lot of sense in hindsight, it's very difficult to understand how was this even thought of and conceived. Well, regardless of who thought it up and how they came to it, this system of federalism has allowed our country to flourish and become one of the best the world has ever seen. In a federal government, some powers belong solely to the national government, some powers solely to the states, and some powers are shared. Those powers that belong solely to the national government are called express powers. Sometimes on the test they may be referred to as delegated powers or enumerated powers. But regardless, we remember that in the first 3 articles of the Constitution they are written down or expressed. A few of those that might jump out to you are the power to declare war, an express power of Congress, the power to coin money, another express power of Congress, the power to confirm appointments, the power to regulate trade, and so on. If you think about it logically on the test, differentiating which powers are expressed to the federal government are just pretty logical. Obviously, the state of California can't declare war. The state of Illinois can't print its own money or it wouldn't be in massive debt that we're in. And the state of Arizona can't regulate trade between New York and, say, Nevada. If there's a question on the portion of the multiple choice test about which powers are expressed, just try to think about it logically. Should a state have the power that the question is asking you? El otro tipo de poder que tenemos en los estados... Oh, I'm so sorry. The other type of power that we're going to look at are powers that belong only to the states. These are called reserved powers. These sometimes are referred to as unenumerated, meaning they're not actually written anywhere in the Constitution. These powers weren't written down, you remember, and a lot of anti-federalists had huge problems with that. They thought the Constitution had to specifically write out everything that states could do. And so the 10th Amendment was added. And this says that basically anything not granted to the federal government or specifically prohibited to the states would be left up to the states. Obviously, there are a ton of these. The power to issue marriage licenses, which is why same-sex marriage is allowed in some states and not others. Power to regulate interstate business, which is why some governors will try to campaign to states with high taxes to bring business into their states with lower taxes. The powers that are shared with los dos, both the federal and the states, are what are known as concurrent powers, meaning they happen at the same time. Some of these include collecting taxes, which is why you pay both a federal income tax, but also your state property tax, your state sales tax. Things like building roads, operating education, a lot more of these that we'll look at later. Our founders were able to predict that having a system might cause some conflicts between state and federal governments. So what it did was it placed several clauses into Article 4, which dealt specifically with federalism. The first of these clauses is not Nick, jolly old Saint Nick. Do you get it, like Santa Claus? Seriously, it's not as funny if I have to explain it. The first of these clauses is known as the Full Faith and Credit Clause. This clause holds that states are required to accept and honor the laws of other states and other certificates. That's why when I moved from Colorado to Illinois, I didn't need to go get a new birth certificate. And when my wife and I were married in Michigan, we didn't need to thankfully redo our wedding, because even though my wife has like 15 Pinterest boards about weddings, we did it once. It's over. This clause basically states that all states in the Union have the full faith and backing of the federal government. The next clause is known as the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Hopefully you remember this means that states can't offer certain privileges or certain compensations for residents of their states. This says that even though states have some sovereignty, you can't treat people unequally. That's why if you go to the Brat Stop, you can't have Illinois resident pays $10 for a burger and Wisconsin resident pays $3. The last clause dealing with federalism is known as the Supremacy Clause, which helps resolve issues when we have federal law and a state law coming at each other. If there's a dispute or a conflict between a federal law and a state law, it's the federal law that is the supreme law of the land, hence the Supremacy Clause. This idea was first established in the court case McCulloch v. Maryland. Remember, Maryland wanted to tax the Bank of the United States, but were unable to do so because federal law trumps state law. This is confirmed with Gibbons v. Ogden, when the state of New York gave water rights to a New York citizen who wanted to charge federal ships. Again, the federal law trumped the state law. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out in the future. Currently, you've probably heard about Colorado and Washington State, who have both passed referendums and laws allowing marijuana, but those laws are in opposition to the federal law currently. So if we've learned anything from history, we know that probably those laws, since they go against a federal law, will eventually be shot down. As our country has grown, changed, and evolved, so has how federalism works. There are several models that will help you remember how federalism has evolved and changed to what it is today. The first model we remember, and you heard it in my rap at the start of this podcast, is known as layered cake dual federalism. This was the earliest idea of federalism, and this is the model that our country used from our founding until the 1930s. In dual federalism, you have clear, distinct roles for both the federal government and the state governments. These are very distinct boundaries. Think of your layer cake. You don't want your vanilla and your chocolate or chocolate mixing together. They each have their own boundary. Same is true with state and federal government during this era of dual federalism. Clear influence, clear policy-making decisions, and clear responsibilities. Around the 1930s, we know the huge problems that we had associated with the Great Depression. We realized that state governments and federal agencies needed to work together. They couldn't solve these on their own. So we begin to morph into what is known as marble cake federalism. Rather than have clear boundaries, we see national, local, and state governments all work together to deal with these big issues. This idea of mixed roles and duties is known as marble cake federalism or cooperative federalism. State and federal cooperating together. We see these still today. You may be watching this podcast on one of our school's iPads, which was paid for a federal grant. Another example here, now it's not just the state of Illinois that cares about your education, but also the federal government. Before 1930s, your education would have solely been Illinois' issue. Also, you wouldn't have been watching this on an iPad. Do you get it? They weren't even invented. While we still see examples of the federal government and states cooperating, this isn't the model we are currently in. We are currently in a model known as New Federalism. Here, we see more and more that a lot of initiatives at the federal level have too much wasted money, too much bureaucracy. We've heard in current events in the news about wasted government money and budget cuts and sequestration. All of that reflects this idea that maybe the states would handle these issues better than the federal issues. This is known as devolution, the transferring of issues back to the states, an example of new federalism. Think about a technology grant. Schools now decide how to spend money on technology. The federal government isn't telling them for them. The last model to help us understand federalism and what we have now is the fantastic form of fiscal federalism. This is not only an awesome alliteration, but it's also what we see mostly today. Here, the national government uses financial money to influence the states. They're able to hold the power of the purse to get the states to do what they want. Think of this as a carrot that you dangle out in front of the states to get them to do what you want. The states are chasing after the carrot, therefore doing what the federal government wants them to do. Think about your parents. They might be bragging to other parents about how great they are as parents. They may say stuff like, "Oh, I trust Johnny to make his own choices about grades." That's new federalism. It's your choice about grades, right? But what they don't brag about to other parents is that your parents aren't going to command you what grades to get, but they might hold money over your head if you don't meet their expectations. If you get all A's, you will get this money. Great example of fiscal federalism. The national government has policy ideas, but rather than forcing them on the states, they dangle money in front of them for the states who comply. That dangling money is called a grant in aid. It's money given out from the federal government for meeting a specific condition. The first type of grant is called a categorical grant. These are for specific categories. They have to be spent in whatever way the federal government says. States don't like these as much because it requires states to spend the money as the federal government commands. The next type states do like. They're called block grants because this money can be spent over a large block of different things. States love this because they can use the money how they see fit. The grant that was used to purchase our iPads was part of a block grant. The money had to be spent in education technology, but they didn't say buy iPads or buy computers. We could spend it as we want. The last vocab term we need to look at is what is known as a mandate. If a grant is a carrot held out in front of a horse getting it to run, a mandate is basically kicking the horse, like kicking Precious Seabiscuit to get him to move. These are directives and orders handed down from the federal national government to the states. One of the more famous examples of this is known as the Americans with Disabilities Act. This said that all public buildings must be accessible to people with handicaps. Oftentimes this was so expensive on the states, and sometimes it was less expensive to tear down a building than to put in all the new guardrails, ramps, and elevators. Oftentimes these are unfunded mandates, meaning all the burden is on the state. These unfunded mandates are often referred to as federal pummeling, or the federal government making life difficult for the states. And at this point, it kind of feels like I'm doing AP pummeling and just pummeling it into your head. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I wish you the best of luck on the test.